Douglas's Havoc was one of the most successful aircraft of the Second World War. Over 7,000 were built and they served from the first moments of the Battle of France all the way through to the Japanese surrender. It may seem strange then that even before it had entered frontline service, the US Army was contemplating the Havoc's replacement. The Havoc, after all, was an aircraft born out of mid-30s aircraft technology and aviation doctrine. It was a slender, even a beautiful aircraft, powered by a pair of supercharged Wright Cyclones. The result was a versatile aircraft, but one with significant compromises in what could be carried in its narrow fuselage. Based on early observations of the war in Europe, in the winter of 1940 the Army decided that it wanted a tactical strike aircraft that could be armed with a 75mm gun, fly at well over 350 miles an hour, and have heavy defensive armament. In their ideal world, the Army hoped to replace the A-20 and also the heavier B-26 Marauder and B-25 Mitchell medium bombers with a single high-performance type. In theory, the Havoc's basic design could have been modified to give these traits. The A-20G would eventually deploy with a rear turret packing twin 50 cal machine guns after all. But Douglas's lead designer, the legendary Ed Heinemann, argued that other aspects would be harder to adjust. For example, the Army wanted crew interchangeability. That meant that the rear gunner should be able to access the cockpit and bombardier station and vice versa. That wasn't feasible in the A-20 as the fuselage was simply too narrow and the bomb bay was in the way. The operational requirement also called for improved short field capability and the ability to make at least a 6G pullout from an attack run. The Havoc was only rated for shallow diving attacks. Given that France had surrendered some months previously and Britain had barely survived the onslaught of the late summer of 1940, the Army was willing to take more or less any good suggestions for future combat aircraft, so long as they might be available in short order. Douglas had established a good reputation over the years, as more recently had Ed Heinemann. They proposed development of a series of wind tunnel models of a new aircraft that could then simply be scaled up into a production aircraft using the smarts they had established on the A-20 program. In doing so, they were proposing that the Air Corps had far greater access to design data than was previously the norm. The A-26 was a pioneer of the procurement approach that dominated in the Cold War, for good or ill. Inspections of the mock-up began in April 1941, leading to contract negotiations in June, which authorized prototypes of the XA-26 attack aircraft, the XA-26A night fighter, and the XA-26B, which mounted the 75mm cannon. The contract was cost-plus and would ultimately prove to be quite expensive for the Air Corps, as the A-26 was a rather sophisticated aeroplane for the day. That 75mm gun is quite a good place to start a description of the A-26, as several different noses were developed, which could be unbolted depending on the mission. In the early days of prototype development, the Air Corps favoured gun armament was the 75mm T-13E1, a close relation of the M3 cannon of the Sherman tank. This was also used in the B-25 Mitchell as an anti-ship weapon, but was apparently intended for anti-tank work in the Invader. 20 rounds were supplied in a ready rack, and the gun was manually loaded, then electrically fired by the pilot. The gunner-loader would usually sit up next to the pilot in a jump seat, and then would drop down to perform his task. Because it was an 11-foot-long weapon, the loader had to sit on a small seat crammed in between the breech and the bulkhead. The gun recoiled just 21 inches on firing. I say just because I was not sitting directly behind it. Spent shell cases were ejected into a catcher at the front of the bomb bay. The whole installation, including the ammunition, weighed a shade under 1,300 pounds. Having said that it was rarely used, the book number says that 35 A-26s were built with the big 75mm, and there are a couple of photos of production aircraft with it, including this photo of a spinnerless A-26B that came a cropper at Barksdale Field, Louisiana in 1944. I'll get to the cause of that and many similar incidents in good time. The tulip-shaped fairing around the barrel in prototype aircraft was for aerodynamic purposes and it wasn't used in the production versions. A small hole in the very centre of the nose cone allowed the gun to be aimed by the gunner loader if needed. Although the manual for the type says that 250 caliber machine guns were on the other side of the nose, those only seem to have been fitted to some aircraft. The first 500 aircraft were due to have the wooden 75mm gun nose, with 200 of the interchangeable metal 6 machine gun noses also ordered as alternatives that could be installed in the field if required. Despite the Army's enthusiasm, the 75mm would fall out of favour quite quickly, as early experiences with rockets demonstrated that they offered more firepower with less weight and complexity, as well as fewer design compromises. That was in the future, and gun configuration development continued. A 75mm gun was eventually combined with an automatic M4 37mm cannon, which would have been pretty impressive to watch in action, as would the twin 37mm version seen here. In August 1941, Douglas and the Air Corps discussed a further version with a 4 37mm cannon nose called the A-26C, but this didn't make it off the drawing board. In any case, no combat use was recorded of any 75mm A-26, nor was there any deployment of the amazing experiment involving the fitment of a 105mm T-12 aircraft cannon. 50 rounds were apparently fired in testing, but no further progress was made. The standard A-26 gun nose therefore had a mere 650 caliber machine guns, upgraded to a more serious 8 guns in later production models. As I said, the noses were interchangeable. They were attached to the main fuselage by 6 bolts. They must have been strong bolts. I'll be back onto noses a bit later. Banks of 350 caliber Brownings could also be mounted in the wings to increase firepower still further. Up to 4 pods, each containing 250s, could also be carried under wing, but I don't think that all of these were ever carried simultaneously. You'd have to think that at some point firing 22 50 cal simultaneously is going to cause an aircraft performance issue. The other armament package was that fitted to the XA-26A Night Fighter, which had 4 20mm cannons below the bomb bay, with the ammunition carried in the bay itself, ahead of up to 2,000 pounds of bombs if required. The nose of this aircraft was 1.5 feet longer and it contained an AI-4 radar. Although the forward gun armament was exceptional, the Invader's defensive armament was the most innovative part of the entire aircraft. It consisted of 2 General Electric remotely controlled gun turrets and a matching GE sighting system. A single gunner could use this periscope to control both turrets without actually sitting in either of them. Both turrets could rotate through 360 degrees, with the top one being able to point from 0 to 90 degrees elevation, the bottom between -5 and -89. As the gunner tracked a target from above the aircraft to below, the turret he was controlling would automatically change as the gunner's viewpoint passed through the aircraft's centerline. Turret rotation was electric, and their movement was based on signals received from a matching set of sensors on the periscope and the gunner's controls. Each turret contained a maximum of 1,000 rounds of ammunition for the twin 50s, and it weighed 311 pounds. The pilot had a set of telltale lights in the cockpit that told him where the guns were pointed, so that he could maneuver the aircraft to give the gunner the best chance of hitting his target. It was a very innovative system, and when it worked, it was lethally effective. Unfortunately, such a complicated system also had its issues with the reliability, and it was very hard to maintain in field conditions. For this reason, many of the A-26s sent to the Pacific had the ventral rear turret removed and a 125-gallon fuel tank installed in its place. The XA-26A also had the lower turret deleted, but its upper turret had 4 guns rather than 2. What it's fair to take away from the discussion of the Invader's armament was that it was very heavy, even if it was basically just an evolution of that deployed on the Havoc. The rest of the aircraft also looks kind of like its predecessor, but was in fact a complete rethink. One of the main instigators of the redesign was availability of a new aluminium alloy called 755, which was lighter and stronger than what Douglas had been able to use on the A-20. Heinemann had also learned a lot about how to shape an aircraft to avoid excessive stress being placed on any part of the fuselage or wings, and thus how to make the whole package more resilient. He also took a recommendation from NACA about a new laminar flow wing that promised lower drag and thus higher speeds, providing Douglas could make the surface smooth and consistent. Nacelle positioning was another thing that the Douglas team took advice from NACA on. The Havoc had been powered by 1600 horsepower Wright Cyclones. For the Invader, Douglas went back to Pratt & Whitney for 2000 horsepower R2800 Wasps. These large engines were placed in long nacelles that projected quite far forward from the wing leading edge, so that the propellers were ahead of the pilot in his cockpit and well ahead of the main landing gear, giving the wheels space to retract. Knacker's view was that the large nacelle would be fine as long as Douglas were able to build the aircraft's skins sufficiently smooth. Douglas did, as it happens, experiment with a design in which the engines were buried in the fuselage and drove the propellers via shafts and gears. In 1944, the XB-42 Mixmaster flew with this system in place, driving contra-rotating pusher propellers. It was, however, too complicated and technically risky given the war emergency, and the Invader went ahead with conventional nacelles. These would be the cause of the greatest criticism of the design when it finally made it to squadrons, as they severely limited the view out to the aircraft's sides. Wing aerodynamics were fine though, and low-speed performance was further enhanced by fitting a new design of flap that used multiple aerofoils to better deflect air and provide 30% greater lift than the items on the Havoc. Heinemann had them patented as the Douglas High Lift Wing Flap, and credited them with reducing landing speeds by 10%. Before leaving the wing, I should mention that to make use of the new aluminium alloy, it was constructed in a novel way that was unique in the US aircraft industry. Each wing had 8 inner and 8 outer spars. Each of the outer ones was the unique casting and not interchangeable with any of the others. This made the wing quite hard to make, an issue made worse by a redesign that was required because static testing of the wing in May 1944 suggested it wasn't strong enough. Modifications meant that the production Invader had a 10% stronger wing structure than the prototypes. The other question in relation to drag was the cross-section of the fuselage. Getting more volume was the priority, suggesting that a squarer profile would be better than a circular one. Although the latter instinctively felt better aerodynamically, wind tunnel testing suggested that there was no actual difference, so Douglas went with the squarer profile. The resultant wider fuselage enabled another criticism of the Havoc to be addressed, namely that the width of the fuselage didn't allow for a co-pilot. Early A-26 prototypes actually had a second control yoke and other controls to allow that man to actually fly the plane during missions, but this was only included on some A-26C Invaders as it impeded access to the nose of the aircraft. The cockpit itself was roomy, even with 2 aboard. The pilot sat to the left, with a jump seat for the gunner, navigator or bombardier on the right. Instruments were well laid out. Flight instruments were directly ahead, the electrical panel on the left and the throttles and other flight instruments were on the pedestal to the right. This positioning allowed the second crewman to operate the throttles in instances when the pilot needed both hands on the control wheel in windy takeoffs and similar situations. Weapons firing controls were on the wheel, with weapons selection controls in various places depending on when the aircraft was built. In general, they were on the left panel, but they moved overhead as more space was needed for them later on. The pilot's gun and bomb sight was a Type A3 and it was mounted on top of the main instrument panel. The canopy was strongly built and flush to the fuselage spine to improve aerodynamics. It opened to facilitate entry into the cockpit and the front of the aircraft via steps set into the right side of the fuselage. You could then climb onto the wing and from there into the aircraft. Behind the cockpit was the bomb bay, which could be accessed by a hatch in the bulkhead at the back of the cockpit. The forward wing spar was also the forward extreme of the 11-foot and 4-inch bomb bay, with the second spar effectively dividing it into 2 discrete sections. The door to the gunner's compartment was on the rear bulkhead. It was a deliberately large space to incorporate a pair of Mark 13 airdrop torpedoes, which were not in fact ever carried by the aircraft. The doors themselves are also therefore quite large. They were hydraulically actuated, and when they were opened, retractable spoilers moved out to deflect air over the large open space. 4 sets of bomb racks were on the inside of the bay, 2 on each side. The front ones were larger, containing 3 racks per set. The aft ones have only 2. Up to 4,000 pounds of bombs could be carried, usually 4 1,000-pounders. Alternatively, 6 500-pound, 8 250-pound or 1,600-pound bombs could be carried. Various modification kits also enabled fragmentation bombs, the torpedoes, or 4 Mark 26 parachute-deployed mines to be loaded if required. Bomb release was initially electric, for selective dropping from one rack, and cable-operated for salvo release. Salvo release later switched to an electrical system as well. The other use of the bomb bay was for additional fuel. For general use, a 125-gallon tank could be installed in the top of the forward part of the bay. For ferrying, a 675-gallon tank could also be fitted. This was, however, not self-sealing, and it wasn't for use in combat. The size of the bomb bay was partly responsible for the longevity of the B-26. In combination with wing-carried stores, it gave a great deal of flexibility. Ed Heinemann specifically designed the fuselage, and the aircraft in general, so that everything that likely needed maintenance was easy to access. Electrical cables and hydraulic lines were arranged in bundles and accessible by removing just one panel. That sounds like an obvious thing to do, but in general it was an afterthought on contemporary designs. It's another example of how Heinemann's practical approach to life bled into the way he designed aircraft. He wasn't uninnovative, it's just that the features that people remember his aircraft for tend to be the practical aspects, like toughness, ergonomics, and general ease of use. Production of an initial 500 aircraft was authorised in October 1941, but even by this point in proceedings there were concerns over supplies of some critical components. By May 1942, Douglas was forced to inform the AAF that delivery of the prototypes had slipped, and thus the same would be true of the production examples. The first flight had been due in January 1942, but it had now slipped to July. Landing gear struts strong enough to support the short and rough field operating environment proved the most troublesome items to source, but war shortages of things like self-sealing fuel tanks, the gun turrets, engines, propeller spinners, and generators also caused delays. Douglas didn't actually receive final design specifications for the turrets until May 2nd, which made designing an aircraft to take said turret problematic. Partly because of this, but also because the A-26 was an innovative aircraft that combined a fighter's speed with heavy firepower and long range, the program was very expensive. An Air Corps report in February 1941 identified the A-26 as the most expensive aircraft in development on a pound-for-pound basis. Attempts to persuade the Douglas team to make savings by trimming standards or capability were, however, unsuccessful. The prototype wouldn't actually fly until the 10th of July 1942, by which point the in-service date had slipped to July 1943. It was these delays in getting tooling ready and setting up production that curtailed development of the other armament options and led to the gun nose carrying the simple but effective 6 or 850 calibers. The only other nose option was the glass bombardier nose that included a Norden bomb sight. Fortunately, the prototype's first flight was very successful. Test pilot Benny Howard said that the aircraft was ready for production just as it was. This aircraft was the XA-26, fitted with the bombardier nose. Several Air Corps pilots got to fly the prototype in the following days and weeks, as officially there were no Douglas pilots with the requisite low-altitude tactical flying experience. They backed up Howard's assessment, leading to considerable excitement about the new aircraft. The first flight of the cannon-armed XA-26B wasn't until nearly a year later, in July 1943. It seems to have been written off on the 21st of October 1943, but details haven't come to light regarding exactly what happened. The XA-26A was the last to fly sometime around September 1943. Exactly what happened to it is a bit unclear as well, but suffice to say it never made it into production, perhaps because of the accelerated development of the P-61 Black Widow. Since the US was now in a hot war on two fronts, the need for aircraft was significant. Even though the prototypes hadn't flown and production on the first batch of A-26s hadn't yet begun, the second order for 500 aircraft was placed in February 1942, even though at this stage the intention was still to have the 75mm gun as the primary option. The Air Corps was seemingly quite confused about exactly what they wanted the A-26's primary mission to be. As late as June 1942, they were actively still seeking 7 versions of the aircraft, those being a conventional medium-altitude bomber with a glass bombardier nose and Norden bomb sight, a tank destroyer with 75mm cannon and bomb bay, a bomber destroyer also with the 75mm cannon but with a radar in the nose and associated electronics in place of the bomb bay, an alternate tank destroyer with 4 37mm cannons in the nose, a ground attack version with 650 calibers in the nose, a night fighter with machine guns and radar, and a photo recon version with fuel tanks in place of the bomb bay. The 75mm option continued to be the Corps' favourite, with provisions made to fit an as yet unspecified radar alongside it. But their needs kept changing around, and as the in-production date slipped further back, Douglas apparently decided to ignore the Air Corps and design a nose that could take multiple different weapon options, on the basis that their customer wasn't likely to make up their mind anytime soon. The all-purpose nose was made of aluminium and steel and had various ports in the front secured with fasteners, enabling different guns to be fitted. Amidst all the chaos, the Bombardier nose, which had slipped out of fashion, was then ordered again. It had large plexiglass panels at the front and also above and below. Inside, there were a set of instruments that relayed things like airspeed, wing incidence, and so on, so that the Bombardier could keep track of things during the bomb run. All A-26s were wired so that the cockpit was compatible with the Norden bomb sight in that nose. A pad was supplied so that the Bombardier could kneel comfortably over the sight while using it, and he also had a pickle switch to release bombs. The resurgence of the Bombardier nose and the cancellation of the night fighter led to there only being two versions of the initial Invader. The B-26B with a multi-purpose gun nose that almost always contained 50 caliber machine guns, and the B-26C with the Bombardier nose. Honestly, you could make a whole video about the gun options for the B-26B. Orders were one thing, but production problems were a constant thorn in Douglas's side, just as they were for Boeing as they tried to get B-29 production started in Wichita, Kansas. As late as the spring of 1944, Hap Arnold had to get personally involved to try and accelerate tooling for A-26 wing spars. Essentially, Douglas had been successful in building a lot of Invader fuselages, but they didn't have enough wings, so lots of fuselages were out there gathering dust. Douglas could make more wings, but they didn't have any spars. They didn't have any spars because US toolmakers had so many other things to do that they hadn't got round to making enough of the right production machinery. Hap Arnold was more than a bit irritated by this, as he wanted large numbers of the new bombers to replace the B-25 and B-26 fleet. With all of these clouds gathered over the A-26 program, the first four production Invaders actually went to war in July 1944 with the 3rd Bomb Group of the 5th Air Force in the Pacific, operating in and around New Guinea. What they were getting, on paper at least, was an aircraft that essentially improved on the A-20 in every way. It was 49 feet long with a 69-foot wingspan. The Havoc was basically the same length, but it had a 61-foot span. Because of the larger fuselage and engines, the Invader was 40% heavier when empty, at 22,300 pounds, but it also had 25% more power. At normal combat weight, the difference in mass was only 12 to 15%, making the Invader faster. 360 miles an hour plays 325. The more streamlined glass-nose A-26 could hit 373 miles an hour in level flight. Better fuel consumption when cruising increased combat range from 900 miles to about 1,300. Maximum payload went up from 4,000 to 6,000 pounds, and of course the Invader had superior defensive firepower if the ventral turret was fitted. But despite these advantages, the initial report on the A-26 was pretty damning. The main issue related to visibility. As I mentioned earlier, because of the large nacelles right next to the pilot, visibility out to the sides was essentially non-existent. The nose had the same effect on the view forwards and down. This precluded the use of a low-level, loose line abreast formation attack as the pilots couldn't see the aircraft that was next to him, and thus he couldn't maintain formation. Range was also judged to be inadequate, and elevator forces in low-altitude pullouts were too high. Although the 3rd Bomb Group pilots liked the firepower when the 8 podded guns were added under the wings, that meant reducing the maximum speed by 25 miles an hour, and thus meant that the A-26 had little advantage over the B-25. Without the wing pods, they considered the 6-gun nose inadequate. 37mm and 75mm guns appear to have been provided, but they weren't used. The report basically said that the A-26 was poorly designed, and that the delays getting it into production meant that it was no longer suitable for the war that was being fought in the Pacific. The report also said that the B-25 was just fine, and that neither type was likely to be much use in a 1946 combat environment. All of that said, despite the misgivings, by the end of the war 11 bomb groups in FIF had either converted or were converting to the A-26. Around 250 aircraft had been deployed to the theatre by August 1945. That does sound like a lot, but in truth it's a fraction of the aircraft available to the US in the Pacific by this point. Douglas went to work on a raised plexiglass canopy that remedied the issue of the sight lines and got a positive write-up from the 3rd when they tested it. More feedback on the early Invader was provided by the RAF's Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, who were lent an A-26B in July 1944. Their view is quite useful as they had no axes to grind and they weren't really interested in buying the A-26 anyway. After 35 hours of flight testing, they concluded that the Invader was an easy, pleasant aircraft to fly with no vices. It rolled very well for a large aircraft. Single-engine handling characteristics were good even when fully loaded. Better still, the cockpit was well laid out, with the exception of some minor engine controls. The view out, however, came in for inevitable criticism as there were too many obstructions like switch panels and the cockpit frame. Only the view directly ahead into port was judged to be good. Control forces were also found to be too heavy, and pilots would tire rapidly when flying it at low level or performing evasive maneuvers. Interestingly, the 9th Air Force in Europe concluded that a decent crew could work around the visibility issues, and thus the Invader was significantly superior to the Havoc. Whether this was a dig at the Pacific Air Force or a tactical reality is hard to determine. Either way, the raised cockpit with reduced framing was quickly developed and it became standard on Invaders. The 9th were reasonably supportive of the Invader all told. Their view was that its speed, firepower, maneuverability, reduced fuel consumption, and lower crew fatigue in the mission profile they were flying made it an ideal aircraft for the European theatre. On top of this, having 4 fewer crew aboard than a B-26 was a significant advantage from a manning perspective. The first 4 evaluation aircraft arrived in the European theatre in July 1944 as well, followed by 15 more in August and the final 5 in September. Having completed conversion training, their first combat mission was on the 6th of September when 13 aircraft dropped 1,000-pound bombs on enemy strongpoints at Brest. Results were judged to be fair to good. They then attacked a bridge at Nancy on the 10th with fair to excellent results, again using 1,000-pound bombs. 2 more missions were launched on the 11th, one with 1,000-pounders and the other with 250s. They were back to 1,000-pound bombs again to attack fortifications at Schelde on the 12th, at Brest on the 14th, and then at Bergen-op-Zoom Dike on the 16th. Early combat employment in the ETO thus appears to have focused on medium-altitude level bombing with the Norden bomb sight, which is perhaps unsurprising given that Havocs had recently moved up out of the weeds in Europe due to excessive losses from flak. The final mission dropped 500-pound bombs on the Durin marshalling yards with good to excellent results. With those combat trials concluded, the trials aircraft went back to the depot and the group was re-equipped with B-26s. I should note at this stage that it was in the European deployment that the first issues with the strength of the Invader's front landing gear began to surface. Several aircraft were written off by its collapse on landing. Wholesale conversion of units to the A-26 nevertheless began in December. Despite the significant firepower that the Invader could lay down, the European low-level operations were no less hazardous than they'd been in the Havoc. The density of ground fire in Europe, combined with the Invader's large size, led to heavy losses when low-level missions were attempted. To give you a good example of that, on January the 23rd, 1945, 7 Invaders set out on a low-level interdiction mission in the area of the Ardennes. 5 of these aircraft were lost to ground fire and 4 of the crews were killed. As a medium-level bomber, though, the A-26 was reasonably successful. 750 of them were in the theatre by the end of the hostilities with Germany. Their move back to the US was prioritised, as the type was judged important for any operation against the Japanese home islands. That never came, but was part of the reason why 2,400 aircraft were added to the Invader production order in December 1944, and another 1,600 in 1945. 5,000 aircraft were thus on order, and production rate was ramping up to a remarkable 500 aircraft a month. By the end of proceedings, 7,703 Invaders had been ordered. But the end of hostilities would limit the total number of aircraft delivered to 1,379 A-26Bs with the gun nose and 1,144 A-26Cs with the bombardier nose. Since those noses were interchangeable in the field in a matter of hours, the actual number of each variant delivered is essentially irrelevant. Aircraft could start a day as a B and end it as a C, and vice versa. Suddenly halting production meant that various alternate versions were stillborn. For example, the Air Corps had requested 96 Night Pathfinder versions equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks in their bomb bays to extend range out to 2,500 miles. LORAN radio direction finding gear and flash suppressors on the exhaust were also fitted. They were to be painted gloss black for extra cool points, but they never made it off the line. Another pathfinding program would have added bomb-bay-mounted navigation radars to A-26Cs, including a protruding radome below the aircraft. Again, they didn't make it. A prototype of a D version of the type using the improved C Series R2800 that gave 2100 horsepower for takeoff and up to 2400 with water injection was modified from an A-26B, and a second was converted post-war. The modification was successful, but it wasn't required, and thus the aircraft was scrapped, as was the sole prototype of the similarly engined A-26E Bombardier variant. Douglas's A-26Z, which had a further raised canopy that was fully sealed for maximum visibility, and in one variation also featured a General Electric J31 jet engine in the rear fuselage, giving 415 mph performance, was deemed interesting but not required in the post-war force. This version had the rear gunner position and both turrets deleted to fit the engine in. It did, however, spawn an experimental XA-26F that featured both the engine in the rear and uprated piston engines, driving 4 rather than 3 bladed propellers. These had spinners for better aerodynamics. Since the jet engine ran on kerosene, the Bombay fuel tank was filled with that and it fed the jet. This combination increased top speed to 435 miles an hour, a useful 23% more than that of the A-26D prototype, but not enough to warrant its actual introduction. The aircraft was actually used as a testbed for some years, and then bailed to the Shell Oil Company as a flying testbed for jet fuels. It remained with them until December 1951. Oddly, it was grounded at Miami International Airport until 1972, when it was unceremoniously scrapped. And with that, the immediate development of the B-26 ended. Judged as a World War II aircraft, it's hard to see it as much more than a curiosity. Delays in development and production meant that it was the most advanced realization of an obsolete aircraft concept. But with that said, it would prove much harder than expected to produce a jet aircraft that could combine the payload and the range of the A-26. When that aircraft did emerge in the form of the F-105 Thunder Chief, it was far too fast and expensive to risk in low-level counterinsurgency work. And so the A-26 would live on in US service well into the 1960s, serving in 2 more US wars and 2 French ones before finally bowing out. But those are videos for another day, or depending on when you're watching this, simply other videos. For those of you who have followed the channel for a while, I hope this video goes some way to correcting previous Marauder-based mistakes. Thanks for watching.